At 7:34 in the morning, local time on Monday, the ground underneath western Colombia let go with a magnitude 7.4 earthquake. And in the hours since, the death toll has climbed past 130 people, with hundreds more still missing under the rubble of collapsed hospitals, schools, and apartment buildings. This is the strongest earthquake to hit Colombia this century, and it happened in a region that hadn't seen anything close to this size in nearly 90 years. I want to walk you through exactly what happened, exactly why this specific earthquake was so destructive despite striking far from any coastline, and what the science tells us about the deeper mechanism that caused it. This is a real, ongoing disaster, and I want to treat it that way, with the actual facts, not just dramatic footage. Stay with me to the end, because I'll also explain how this connects to a similar, even deadlier disaster that struck neighboring Venezuela just weeks ago, and what that pairing tells scientists about the stress building across this entire region. If you want to be here for updates as rescue efforts continue, subscribe to Nemora Proof before we get into it. Let me start with exactly what happened and where, because the location of this earthquake is central to understanding why it caused so much damage. The epicenter was located near San José del Palmar, a small community of roughly 4,800 people in the Chocó region of western Colombia, about 250 miles west of the capital, Bogotá. The United States Geological Survey and Colombia's own Geological Service both recorded the quake at magnitude 7.4, striking at a depth of approximately 66 miles, or 107 kilometers, beneath the surface. That depth matters enormously to this story, and I'll come back to exactly why in a moment, because it's the key to understanding why a quake this size caused the kind of destruction we're now seeing across multiple cities. The shaking wasn't confined to one town near the epicenter. It tore through cities across a wide stretch of western Colombia. Cali, the country's third largest city, Pereira, Quibdó, Manizales, and Armenia all reported serious damage, with buildings collapsing in multiple locations. In Cali, rescue teams and civilians spent hours picking through the remains of destroyed structures with their bare hands, trying to reach anyone still trapped. In Pereira, a 7-story building near Plaza Bolívar came down entirely, and among the most heartbreaking details to emerge so far, the pediatric and neonatal sections of a hospital in Cali were among the structures that collapsed, forcing emergency crews into an urgent, harrowing rescue effort involving some of the most vulnerable patients imaginable. The tremor was strong enough to be felt as far away as Bogotá itself, and reports of shaking reached across the border into neighboring Ecuador and Panama. As of the most recent update, at least 132 people have been confirmed dead and roughly 570 injured, according to Colombia's Association of Capital Cities, and officials have been clear that those numbers are expected to keep rising as search and rescue operations continue and communication is restored to more isolated communities in the affected region. Colombia's government has declared a national disaster, deployed soldiers to assist with the response, and the hardest hit cities, Pereira, Cali, Quibdó, Manizales, and Armenia, all remain under the country's highest level disaster alert. At least 21 aftershocks have already been recorded in the hours since the main shock, complicating rescue efforts and keeping already damaged structures at continued risk of further collapse. Now, let me explain the science behind why this earthquake happened, because the mechanism here is genuinely different from what most people picture when they think of a major earthquake, and understanding it explains almost everything about how this disaster unfolded. Western Colombia sits at one of the most geologically complicated junctions on the planet, a place where the Nazca Plate, the South American Plate, and the Caribbean Plate all interact, producing frequent seismic activity as a matter of course. But this particular earthquake wasn't a simple case of two plates grinding directly against each other at their boundary, which is the mechanism most people picture when they hear earthquake. Instead, this was what's called an intraslab earthquake, meaning it occurred within the Nazca Plate itself, at a point where that plate is subducting, or diving, down beneath the North Andes region. As a subducting slab of oceanic crust descends into the Earth's mantle, it bends and heats up under enormous pressure, and that bending process can itself generate powerful earthquakes, entirely separate from the friction happening at the boundary where the plates first meet. Independent earthquake scientists examining the data have said it's not yet entirely clear which specific fault produced this rupture. But what is clear is that it occurred along a strike-slip fault, meaning the two sides of rock slid horizontally past each other rather than one thrusting up and over the other. And because the depth of this event, more than 60 miles down, indicates it wasn't caused by direct friction between the plates at their interface, the working scientific explanation is that this earthquake resulted from stress building up and finally releasing inside the Nazca Plate itself, deep beneath the surface, as it continues its slow descent into the mantle. I want to be honest about the uncertainty here too, because that's the responsible way to cover a story like this. The exact physical mechanisms that produce large intraslab earthquakes like this one are still genuinely debated within the scientific community. This isn't a case of scientists withholding information from the public. It's a case of a phenomenon that remains an active area of ongoing research, even among the specialists who study it most closely. Here's why the depth of this earthquake actually made the damage worse in a specific, counterintuitive way. And I think this is one of the most important details in this entire story. You might assume a shallower earthquake would always be more dangerous than a deep one, but it's more complicated than that. A shallow earthquake tends to cause extremely intense, violent shaking concentrated in a smaller area directly above the rupture. A deeper earthquake, like this one, spreads its energy across a much wider footprint, producing less violent shaking at any single point, but distributing damaging shaking across a far larger geographic area. That's a significant part of why this earthquake caused serious structural damage across multiple major cities simultaneously, rather than devastating one town intensely while leaving everywhere else largely untouched. And that brings me to a comparison that's been on the minds of a lot of seismologists watching this unfold, because this isn't the only major earthquake to strike this region in recent months. Back in June, a pair of earthquakes struck neighboring Venezuela within a minute of each other, registering magnitude 7.2 and magnitude 7.5, respectively. A similar overall size to Monday's quake in Colombia, and in some ways even more powerful. But the outcome in Venezuela was dramatically worse, with the death toll from those two earthquakes surpassing 6,000 people. Understanding why requires looking at exactly the mechanism I just explained. Unlike Monday's Colombia earthquake, the Venezuela quakes occurred on two different fault systems at depths of less than 15 miles, or roughly 24 kilometers, far shallower than the roughly 66-mile depth of the Colombia event. That shallowness concentrated the destructive shaking within a much smaller geographic area, but made it far more violent within that footprint, which is precisely why those two quakes caused such catastrophic, concentrated devastation and such an enormous death toll despite being a broadly similar magnitude to what just struck Colombia. Placing these two disasters side by side tells scientists something important about the broader region right now. This part of South America sits atop one of the most seismically active and structurally complex zones on the planet, where multiple tectonic plates are simultaneously colliding, subducting, and grinding past one another. Two major earthquakes of similar overall size, striking two neighboring countries within the span of about 2 months, is a genuine reminder of just how much accumulated stress this entire region has been carrying. Though I want to be careful here, the way responsible coverage of earthquake science always should be. These are not the same fault system, and one earthquake did not cause the other. Treating separate earthquakes on separate fault structures as dominoes lined up to trigger each other is exactly the kind of oversimplified thinking that leads to inaccurate panic rather than genuine understanding. What connects them isn't a direct mechanical link. It's that they're both expressions of the same broader tectonic reality, an extraordinarily active plate boundary zone that has now produced two devastating earthquakes in rapid succession. Let me also address the historical context, because it explains why this earthquake caught so many communities structurally unprepared. According to seismologists reviewing the historical record for this specific part of Colombia, the largest previous earthquake in this exact region was a magnitude 7 event all the way back in 1938, and the most recent earthquake of magnitude 6.5 or larger in the area occurred in 1995. That means Monday's magnitude 7.4 earthquake likely represents the first time in the living memory of most residents, and quite possibly the first time in the entire service life of most existing buildings and infrastructure in the region that this area has been tested by shaking this strong. Colombia's own geological service has confirmed this is the highest magnitude earthquake registered in the country in the last decade, and multiple outlets covering the disaster have described it as the most powerful tremor to hit Colombia this century. When a region goes this many decades without experiencing an earthquake near this magnitude, building codes, retrofitting practices, and public earthquake preparedness can all lag behind what the actual underlying seismic hazard requires, not out of negligence, but simply because the last direct lived experience of shaking this severe predates most of the infrastructure currently standing. I want to spend a moment on the human side of this, because it's easy for a story like this to become a collection of numbers and technical explanations, and I don't want that to be the whole of what I leave you with. At least 132 confirmed deaths, with that number expected to rise. Hundreds of people still missing. Families in Cali, Pereira, Quibdó, Manizales, and Armenia, right now standing outside collapsed buildings, waiting for word on people they love. Rescue workers, some of them civilians who simply showed up to help with their bare hands, working through rubble that could shift again with any one of those 21 aftershocks already recorded since the main shock. This is happening as I'm putting this video together, and the picture is still very much developing. So let me walk through what's actually being done in response, because there is real organized effort underway. Colombia's president, has declared a national emergency to expedite funding and resources into the affected region. Soldiers have been deployed to assist with search and rescue and to help secure areas where buildings remain structurally compromised. The hardest hit cities remain under the country's highest disaster alert level, which allows for accelerated resource allocation and coordination between local and national emergency services. International aid offers have begun coming in as well, which is standard and expected for a disaster of this scale, though the full scope of that coordinated response is still taking shape in these early hours and days. Now, let me talk about what comes next from a purely scientific standpoint, because this is exactly the kind of situation where understanding the near-term risk matters for the people still in the affected region. Aftershocks are the immediate concern, and they will continue for some time. Major earthquakes of this magnitude typically produce aftershock sequences that can persist for weeks or even months following the main shock, generally decreasing in both frequency and size over time. The larger aftershocks in the days immediately following a major quake are not unusual and shouldn't be dismissed as impossible. For anyone in the affected region, that means continued caution around any structure that shows visible damage, even if it's still standing, because a building weakened by the main shock can be brought down by a comparatively modest aftershock that it would have easily withstood before Monday. I also want to address something directly, because I know it's the kind of question that surfaces after every major earthquake like this. Does this mean a bigger earthquake is coming to the region? Or that this is part of some larger chain reaction building towards something worse? The honest, scientifically grounded answer is that there's no evidence supporting that kind of escalating chain reaction framing. Earthquakes on different fault systems, even in the same broader tectonic region, are not sequentially triggering one another in the way that framing implies. What connects Monday's earthquake in Colombia to June's earthquakes in Venezuela is shared geological context, an extraordinarily active zone of plate interaction, not a causal chain where one event mechanically sets off the next. That distinction matters, because treating separate disasters as one unfolding domino sequence tends to produce panic that isn't supported by the actual seismology, while genuinely obscuring the real, well-documented risk that this region has always carried. It sits atop of one of the most seismically active zones on Earth, and it will continue to produce major earthquakes as a simple fact of its tectonic setting, independent of any pattern matching between recent events. Here's the practical information that matters most right now, both for anyone in the affected region and for anyone watching from elsewhere who wants to help. If you're in Western Colombia, particularly in or near Cali, Pereira, Quibdó, Manizales, or Armenia, continue following guidance from local emergency services regarding which structures are safe to re-enter, and treat any building with visible cracking or structural damage as off-limits until it's been formally inspected, regardless of how it looked before Monday. Aftershocks can and do bring down already weakened structures with little to no additional warning. If you have loved ones in the affected region and haven't been able to reach them, official channels through the Colombian Association of Capital Cities and National Emergency Services are the most reliable source for updates, given how quickly the situation is still evolving and how communication has been disrupted in some of the harder hit and more isolated communities. Before I close this out, I want to say something plainly, without wrapping it in a scientific explanation, because I think it deserves to stand on its own. A disaster like this is never just a magnitude number and a list of affected cities. It's hospitals with children inside them collapsing. It's people who went to bed Sunday night with no idea Monday morning would look like this. And it's a rescue effort right now, in real time, of ordinary people digging through rubble next to soldiers and emergency crews, trying to bring as many people home as possible before conditions make that impossible. I'll be honest with you about where things stand and where the uncertainty remains. The death toll is very likely to continue rising over the coming days, as search efforts reach more isolated areas and as damaged buildings are more fully assessed. The exact fault responsible for this earthquake is still being studied and debated among seismologists, and the full scope of the humanitarian response and what recovery looks like for these communities is something that will unfold over weeks and months, not the next 24 hours. Before you go, I want to ask something a little different than usual, given the weight of this story. If you have any connection to Colombia or to this region, or if this is simply a disaster you hadn't heard much about until watching this, let me know in the comments. I read every single one, and this community consistently shapes what I follow up on and how closely I keep tracking a story like this one after the initial headlines fade from everyone else's feed. If this gave you a clearer, more complete picture of what actually happened and why, hit that like button, because it genuinely helps careful, factual coverage like this reach more people instead of just the most dramatic clips circulating without context. Subscribe to 9 More Proof so you're here for updates as rescue efforts continue and as we learn more about the fault responsible for this earthquake. My heart goes out to everyone in Colombia affected by this right now, and to everyone still searching for someone they love. I'll see you in the next one.